Good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever time you may be viewing this presentation, economic students. This is part 4 of our introductory videos concerning basic economic thinking and the principles and concepts related to the field of economics. In a prior video, we defined economics as the social science primarily concerned with maximum satisfaction of human wants, given the fact that there are limited or scarce resources. So in this particular video, the first topic is to discuss the two broad fields within the field of economics. So the topic of economics is broken into two subtopics, microeconomics being the first of those two. So microeconomics is study of the individual pieces or parts or components of the economy and the behavior of those individual components of the larger economy. So you have a statement here that says the computer industry continues to grow. That would be a microeconomic statement because it's principally concerned with one specific industry within the broader economy. In microeconomics, you may investigate topics such as how does a company operating in a nearly purely competitive market set price, and why would we want pure competition to be our model or paradigm for industries? What is the social benefit of pure competition? Another topic might be something about regulation and government regulation, specifically as it relates to monopolies. If one company, say the electric company, is the only game in town when it comes to producing a certain good, or in this case providing a certain service, what price should we allow the company to charge? In other words, the company has to make a profit. Just because they're the only game in town, we can't say that we overregulate them, because if the company doesn't make any profit, they will not be incentivized to continue operating. So those are some topics within the framework of microeconomics. Macroeconomics. Well, if you were only to take one of these two courses, let's assume you're not a business major, you're not an economics major, then macro would probably be far more relevant to your life, because the topics of macroeconomic include an investigation into the aggregate, the economy as a whole, the behavior of the entire country's economic performance. And this is generally more important because it makes students aware of some topics that all citizens should know something about, especially if you're going to vote in elections and you're going to have a job and you're going to want to make some intellectual arguments with your friends about certain situations in the United States and more broadly in the globe. So the topics within macroeconomics are things like fiscal and monetary policy, GDP, unemployment, trade balance. These are things that you hear about in the news regularly. So for instance, if the economy grew at 1.8% last quarter, is that a good number? Is it a bad number? Why is it a good number or a bad number? How does it affect the number of people who have jobs? The general price level in the economy, is inflation out of control, or is, believe it or not, is the price level growing too slowly? And then the big questions relate to the topics of fiscal and monetary policy. When something is wrong in the economy or with the economic picture, how can the federal government, those in Washington, D.C., or our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, through fiscal and monetary policy, alter the course of economic events? So most of the time, macro is more pertinent to the average everyday person's life. So here's a typical macroeconomic statement. GDP grew at 2% in 2008. Now, what about, we have here positive versus normative economics. Positive economics is simply statements about reality, the way things are. So if I say unemployment rate is currently 5%, I'm not making any judgment, I'm not interjecting my own opinion, I'm not making any value-based statement. Positive economics are objective statements about the reality of any economic situation. Normative economics is more based on opinion. Now, of course, that opinion is grounded in economic thinking, but notice the statement here that this is the worst job market in 30 years. Whenever you hear judgmental statements, you're probably evaluating a normative economic topic or statement. As you can imagine, most discrepancy in argumentation among economists is normative economics. So, for instance, should the United States raise taxes on higher income earners? Now, you can have two PhDs who are highly educated and speak fluently the lingo of economics, but have quite varying opinions on this specific topic. Economic methodology. Some of the economic principles and concepts we are attempting to introduce in this introductory chapter deal with these specific ideas within economic methodology. The first one, economics terminology. Economists use words, terms that we think we are familiar with because of our experience in life, sometimes quite differently than the typical understanding or connotation of that term. So, for instance, when you pick up a newspaper and you see that it says on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, gross business investment fell by 0.02% last quarter. The term investment does not mean a company bought a stock or a bond or some type of financial instrument. Investment spending has to deal with the purchase of machines or equipment or manufactured tools or aids. That term investment has a very specific meaning within the framework of economics. So just be careful as we go through this study of economics that you identify some of the terminology that economists use differently than the average everyday person. Number two, generalizations. Economists are trying to make sense of the broader world and what's going on with the big picture within the framework of knowing that people don't always act the same. But to make sense of what is going on in the world, we have to speak in terms of generalizations. So, for instance, what we're trying to capture is what is called tendency of the norm. So, for instance, if the price of Coca-Cola were to increase by 125%, ceteris paribus, we'll talk about this one in a moment, other things being equal, most people would start to buy Pepsi. Now, there are going to be some extremely loyal Coke fans who don't care that Coke now costs more than twice as much as Pepsi. But to make sense of what's going on in the world, economists are going to follow the herd, so to speak. When 90% of individuals act in a certain way to economic incentives, it is going to be important for us to make sense of the real world using generalizations. Now, this third economic methodology, ceteris paribus, a Latin phrase for other things being equal, it sort of goes along with number 2 and number 4, this idea of modeling the economy. Economists do not have the luxury that chemists or biologists have working in a lab. We cannot isolate one variable and test it ad nauseum to make certain that our predicted outcome or our hypothesis works out to be 100% accurate all the time. So when economists are trying to make sense of the real world, what they do is, if we want to evaluate one variable, we assume nothing else in the world is changing to try to make sense of that one economic event. So, for instance, ceteris paribus, other things being equal, if the federal government lowers taxes, individuals tend to spend more of their disposable income, their after-tax income. Now, other things being equal, ceteris paribus, we're saying assume that nothing else has changed in the economy. We know that other things could change. That is a strong possibility. But to make sense of that one economic event, in this case lower taxes, let's assume for the moment that nothing else is changing. So, for instance, nothing else meaning we haven't gone into some severe recession where even if you have a little bit more disposable income, you're worried about your job security. The last one, economic models and graphical expression. Economists love to use graphs to model the real world, both in micro and macroeconomics. So graphical expression is something that students are going to have to spend some time with and get used to. And economic modeling is also important. Now, models are only useful if they resemble and they relate to real world events. But when building economic models, economists only have the ability to include certain variables which are extremely important because it would be impossible to include every single detail. So for instance, if you were traveling from, say, Pennsylvania to Sacramento, California, and you were not allowed to use GPS, you would bring a map with you. On the map, it would have the highways and byways, the major roadways of the United States. It would not have on there every Burger King and every Starbucks and every gas station. Economists know that people can figure some of those things out for themselves. Same thing with building economic models. We include all the important big things, ignoring some of the small things. Okay, pitfalls to sound economic thinking. One is biases. In other words, if you come into this class and you think, oh, capitalist bourgeoisie pigs, anybody who's a businessman is always greedy and doesn't care about other human beings, well, that type of bias will not really get you far when trying to study a topic. And if you're likewise biased on the other side, it will not help. Definitions, we already said this one, the idea that economists use terms differently than the average everyday human being, so be careful when using some of these definitions, some of these words that economists have quite different meanings for than we're used to. Fallacy of composition. This one's a fun one. Fallacy. Now this is a fallacy, so what I'm about to say is false, negative. It is not true. What is good for the individual is good for the group as a whole. That's not true. That's a fallacy. So for instance, if one farmer has what's called a bumper crop, an amazing growing season where 100% of the seeds they planted end up producing an abundance of fruits or vegetables, that farmer thinks, oh man, I'm going to crush it. I'm going to have so much to sell. I'm going to make a huge profit, right? So it's good for that one individual. But what happens when every farmer has the same experience in the growing season? Well, then supply increases so much that there's a bountiful amount to sell, and that huge amount to sell brings down price. So what was good for the individual was definitely not good for the group as a whole. So we cannot assume that what is good for an individual is good for the whole. All right, some causation fallacies. The first one, this is fun to say, especially if you studied a little bit of Latin or you took a philosophy class. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Sounds really smart and intimidating, but it's simply saying this. Just because A preceded B, A caused B. Now, that is a fallacy. If one event comes before another event, it does not mean that event A caused event B. So for instance, the rooster crows at 5:48 a.m. and the sun rises at 6:01 a.m. Did the rooster crowing have anything to do with the sun rising? Because it came before that event? Obviously not, right? So for instance, we can't just assume that say, for instance, that, I don't know, Washington, D.C., the federal government lowered taxes and then the economy got better 2 months later. Did the tax cuts cause the improvement in economic output? That may be the case, but it can be completely false to assume that simply because one event came before another event, it caused the second event to occur. The last one, correlation versus causation. So, people who have a college degree tend to earn more money over the course of their lifetime. We could wrongly assume that it is the education leading to the occupational success. It could be that people who earn college degrees are simply more intelligent, more motivated, more innovative, more creative, have a better level of focus than other people. So the education might have nothing to do with their occupational success.